In 2004, the quiet highways of China became a dark stage for a terrifying drama. A man, left in the rubble of his shattered life, set forth on a mission of vengeance that would leave a scar on the nation's soul. Li Guangjun, abandoned by his wife, would leave a trail of bodies in his wake. What does a man do when he's stripped of everything he holds dear? What happens when grief and bitterness collide with a twisted need for retribution? Li Guangjun's story begins in the shadows of broken love, and it would end in blood. Left by his wife, Li's world crumbled. His heart shattered, and from that darkness, a monstrous need for revenge began to fester. His heart was no longer just broken, it was consumed with hatred, and his pain would soon echo in the lives of others. Women. They would become his targets, but not because they had wronged him directly. In his fractured mind, they represented the very betrayal he couldn't bear. Every woman he saw became a symbol of his wife's rejection. And in their death, he would find twisted redemption. Li's need for revenge wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Each victim he targeted on those lonely roads symbolized his struggle to regain control over his shattered life. In his mind, their deaths would somehow ease his torment. Li was a methodical killer, not driven by impulse, but by a deep-rooted obsession with control. He had no immediate plans. The revenge wasn't personal in the traditional sense, it was about reclaiming something that was lost to him, his power. On the highways, his killings were ritualistic. A pattern began to emerge. His victims were women, often alone, and always vulnerable. Li had studied them, understood their fragility, and used it to fuel his dark purpose. He was methodical, turning his anger into a chilling execution. His method was brutal, yet efficient. Li would strike quickly, leaving no room for resistance. His weapon of choice, a knife. It was clean, sharp, and symbolic of his need to inflict pain in the most intimate way possible. No mercy. Just a silent, methodical end. Why highways? Why women? In the isolation of the roads, Li found an eerie comfort. He was in control. No witnesses. No interruptions. Just him and the victim. Each murder was a reaffirmation of his power, his ability to dominate a world that had cast him aside. The killings would continue for years, and with each one, Li's power grew. But who would be next? What would it take for the authorities to stop him? The investigation was just beginning, and the darkness surrounding Li Guangjun was far from over. But the question lingers: what truly drove him to become a killer? Li Guangjun's journey from a man betrayed by love to a cold-hearted killer didn't happen overnight. It began long before the first murder, in the painful folds of his childhood and early adulthood, where feelings of rejection and helplessness took root. His descent into violence was gradual, but inevitable. Born in 1965 in a small rural village in China, Li's early years were marked by poverty and emotional neglect. His parents were distant, providing little in the way of affection or emotional support. Li was raised in an environment where love was a luxury, and emotional connection a distant dream. Psychologically, this lack of nurturing and emotional support often leads to deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and anger. In cases like Li's, the individual internalizes their pain, often turning it outward when it reaches a boiling point. For Li, the abandonment by his wife was the final straw, an event that triggered years of unresolved emotional trauma. As Li's life spiraled after the divorce, it became clear that his hatred was not just reserved for his wife. His mind began to distort, and his resentment expanded to all women. In his world, they became interchangeable, all representing the source of his deep betrayal. This is where his criminal psyche started to emerge. Criminal psychology teaches us that serial killers often project their emotional wounds onto their victims. For Li, each woman he killed was a reflection of the wife who left him, her absence fueling a twisted revenge that was far more about regaining control than about the victims themselves. Li's first murder, carried out in 2004, was not an act of impulsive rage. It was a cold, calculated decision driven by an overwhelming need for control. By targeting women on lonely highways, he established a pattern, one that he would repeat with increasing precision. His method was purposeful, not random. What made Li's approach so chilling was the way he planned each attack. He didn't just kill randomly, he stalked his victims, choosing them based on their vulnerability. Women walking alone on desolate highways became his prey. His mind was methodical, like a predator patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In terms of psychological profiling, Li's behavior fits the criteria of a power and control killer. Unlike other types of murderers, who may be driven by jealousy or financial gain, Li's killings were about dominance. He wanted to feel in control of something, anything, in a life that had made him feel powerless. Many criminal psychologists argue that the root of Li's violence wasn't just about anger, it was about power. The killings gave him a sense of mastery over the situation, something he desperately craved after being abandoned by the person who once held the power to hurt him. His violence became a perverse attempt to reclaim that lost power. The method of his murders, targeting women, attacking them on lonely highways, was symbolic of the emotional battlefield he fought within himself. Each life he took was a twisted form of revenge, but it was also an act of reasserting control in a world that had rejected him. The question remains, could the pain of his abandonment have been addressed in a way that would have spared the lives of his victims? The first murder took place in 2004, marking the beginning of a terrifying spree. Li's first victim was an innocent woman walking alone on a highway at night. She had no idea that the man approaching her harbored such a twisted desire for control. In the blink of an eye, her life was taken, and Li had begun his deadly mission. Li's killings were not random. They were deliberate, each one a carefully executed act of vengeance. His victims were always women, always alone, always at their most vulnerable. Li's method was ruthless. He would attack swiftly, using his knife to silence them before leaving them by the roadside. What drove Li to target women specifically? For him, every woman he encountered represented a symbol of the rejection he had suffered from his wife. His violent acts weren't just random, they were part of a twisted narrative, a script written in the anger and hurt that had consumed him for years. The attacks were swift and precise. Li wasn't just driven by rage, he was calculating, almost surgical in his approach. His knife was not just a weapon, it was an instrument of control. He would silence his victims quickly, leaving them to die alone in the quiet of the night. Each victim was chosen not just for their isolation, but because they represented something to Li, something that he could never get back. His wife's abandonment had led him to view women as instruments of pain, and their deaths were his twisted attempt at reclaiming power over the pain he felt. The murders were always clean. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. The pattern emerged clearly to the police. Each victim had been attacked on a highway, each left alone to die in silence. It was as though Li had mastered the art of death, striking with precision and vanishing without a trace. For the police, this was the beginning of a nightmare. With each new murder, The pressure to catch the killer mounted. Li's methods left little to go on, and the more women he killed, the more elusive he became. Yet, despite the chilling repetition of the crimes, there was no clear lead, no hint of who this predator could be. Li's ability to avoid detection was chilling. He had no particular weapon of choice, just the knife, and a level of cold efficiency that made it difficult for the police to predict his next move. The pattern of his crimes seemed so simple, yet so impenetrable. Why had he chosen highways? Why did the women seem to have no connection to each other? Li's killings were not only a form of revenge, they were a way for him to reclaim control. In his mind, each act of violence was justified. He wasn't just punishing women, he was punishing the world that had wronged him. His crimes became an expression of the power he had lost, a power he would never get back. But as the body count rose, so did the suspicion. The authorities began to ask, what made Li so cold? What gave him the courage to continue killing without remorse, without hesitation? The hunt for the killer was on, but Li remained a shadow, always one step ahead. To truly understand Li Guangjun, we must step into his mind, into the space where deep-rooted anger and betrayal bred a killer. His path to violence wasn't one of sudden fury, but rather a calculated, slow-burn anger that had been simmering for years. The death of his wife had shattered his emotional stability, but it was his inability to process this betrayal that ultimately led to the murders. Psychologists who study serial killers often point to a key factor in their development: emotional neglect. Li grew up in an environment where affection was scarce. His inability to form meaningful emotional connections with others left him vulnerable to intense feelings of powerlessness, which manifested in violent acts as an adult. His wife's abandonment was the final trigger, a rejection that cut to the core of his self-worth. After his wife left him, Li became consumed with bitterness. The anger was not just for the personal loss, it was about control. To Li, the act of abandoning him was a symbol of the loss of his power over his life. He began to see women as symbols of betrayal, and that perception turned into an all-consuming hatred. His need for control over his circumstances became the driving force behind the murders. Serial killers often follow a pattern, and for Li, that pattern was driven by power, specifically, the need to assert control over women. The highway killings were not random, they were carefully orchestrated acts of domination. By targeting women alone in isolated areas, Li ensured his victims had no chance to fight back. His method wasn't just about murder, it was about stripping them of their autonomy, just as he felt stripped of his own. Psychologically, Li was not driven by the common motives of jealousy or greed. His violence was motivated by something deeper, a need to feel powerful in a world where he felt weak. Li's actions were not an explosion of anger, but a cold, methodical way to reassert himself in a life that had left him feeling insignificant. Each murder was an effort to reclaim that sense of power. According to psychological experts, this need for control is often a hallmark of serial killers. For Li, the act of killing women became a way to not only inflict harm but to establish dominance over a world he felt had betrayed him. His method of killing, carefully selecting his victims, stalking them, and using a knife, was about ensuring he was in complete control of the situation. Li's pattern of choosing women who were vulnerable, those walking alone on empty highways, reveals another key aspect of his psychology: his need for an easy target. His victims were not chosen at random, but rather for their perceived weakness. This selection process reflects Li's twisted view of women as something to be controlled and dominated. Li's hatred for women was not just about his wife, it was about a deep-seated resentment towards anyone who he perceived as a threat to his control. Women, in his eyes, were a symbol of the emotional power he had lost. His killings were an expression of the rage that had been brewing for years, and each murder was an attempt to exert dominance and control in a world that had abandoned him. Psychologically, Li's need to dominate and control was rooted in his own sense of powerlessness. The abuse and neglect he experienced as a child, combined with his wife's abandonment, created a man who could no longer cope with the loss of power. His crimes were his way of reasserting control over a world that had left him vulnerable. Could Li's crimes have been prevented? Would he have chosen a different path if he had found emotional support, or if he had been able to process his pain in a healthy way? This case highlights the dangerous consequences of unresolved emotional trauma and the destructive power of unchecked anger. As the killings continued, the police were left scrambling to connect the dots. Li Guangjun was a ghost, elusive and careful. No fingerprints, no DNA, and no clear motive. His crimes seemed to vanish as quickly as they occurred. The only thing that remained was the terror he left behind. The authorities were stumped. Each murder appeared to be an isolated incident, with no clear link between the victims. The only connection was the method: women alone, attacked on remote highways. It was a chilling pattern, but one that was too vague to provide any concrete leads. The first breakthrough came in 2005, when investigators began to notice the timing of the murders. Li's victims were attacked at different times, but always in the dead of night, often around the same time of year. This small pattern helped shift the investigation into a new direction. Despite the mounting pressure, the police struggled to gather enough evidence to make an arrest. Li's methodical approach to murder, combined with his complete absence of physical evidence at the crime scenes, made him an almost invisible predator. The investigation had reached a deadlock. Li's ability to evade detection was chilling. He wasn't a criminal who left chaos in his wake. He was quiet, efficient, and deliberate. The more he killed, the more confident he became. He felt untouchable, and the authorities struggled to stay one step ahead of his twisted game. With no physical evidence and no witnesses, the authorities were forced to rely on psychological profiling to catch their killer. Criminal psychologists studied the pattern of Li's killings, trying to get inside his mind. They concluded that the killer's need for control and power over women was key to understanding his behavior. The breakthrough came through forensic science. DNA analysis, which had once been a roadblock, began to catch up with the killer. Li left no obvious clues, but his crimes, as systematic as they were, eventually allowed for his DNA to be linked to the crime scenes. It was the break the police had been waiting for. Li was finally identified through a combination of old evidence and cutting-edge forensic technology. His DNA matched samples found at multiple crime scenes, and it wasn't long before the authorities zeroed in on their prime suspect. The man who had terrorized the highways for years was now within their grasp. With Li's identification came the start of the hunt. For years, he had been a ghost, unseen, unnoticed, moving through the shadows. Now, the chase was on. But would they catch him before more lives were lost? The pressure on the investigators was immense, and every moment counted. In 2005, after a relentless investigation, Li Guangjun was finally captured. The man who had terrorized the highways for over a year was now behind bars. For the victims and their families, the long pursuit had ended, but the scars left behind would remain for a lifetime. In 2005, After years of investigation and mounting pressure, Li Guangjun was finally captured. The man who had haunted China's highways, taking innocent lives, was now in police custody. But despite his capture, many questions remained. Why did a man like Li turn to murder? What drove him to kill, not out of passion, but out of a deep, twisted need for control? Li's arrest was not the end of the story. The trial would become a public spectacle, with the country watching closely. His crimes had sent shockwaves through the nation, and now, it was time for justice. But could there ever be true justice for the families whose lives were irrevocably changed by his actions? At his trial, Li Guangjun showed no signs of remorse. He spoke little, his demeanor cold and indifferent. It was as if the emotional turmoil that had driven him to kill had been extinguished, leaving behind only a shell of the man who had once been consumed by rage. His defense was simple: he was driven by an overwhelming need for control, fueled by a lifetime of emotional neglect and betrayal. But how do you explain a mind so twisted, a life so broken, that it could result in the death of so many innocent women? Was he truly a product of his environment, or was there something inherently dangerous inside him from the beginning? The prosecution laid out the evidence against him, the pattern of killings, the psychological profile that fit a power-driven serial killer, and the final, damning evidence: his DNA. It was clear that Li was not just a man wronged by love, but a predator who had been lurking in plain sight. Li Guangjun was sentenced to death. For the families of the victims, the verdict was a bitter form of justice. It could not bring their loved ones back, nor could it erase the horror Li had inflicted on their lives. But for the public, it was a necessary closure to a haunting chapter. The verdict did little to quell the larger questions raised by Li's crimes. Was he simply a product of a broken system, a man whose life had been shaped by emotional neglect and rejection? Or was there something inherently monstrous in his soul, a darkness that couldn't be explained away by his tragic past? The case of Li Guangjun will forever serve as a haunting reminder of how unchecked emotional trauma can manifest into something far darker. While justice was served, it raises an unsettling truth: sometimes the seeds of violence are planted early, in the silence of neglect and abandonment. Li Guangjun's name will forever be linked to a series of brutal killings, but his story is more than just the tale of a killer. It is the story of a man consumed by pain and rejection, who turned his rage into a weapon against those he could never control. In the end, the question remains: could anything have prevented him from becoming the monster he was? Thank you for joining us in uncovering the chilling story of Li Guangjun. If this case has left you with questions and reflections, be sure to subscribe to Crime in Review. Don't forget to like, share, and comment with your thoughts. Together, we'll continue to explore the world of crime and justice. Li Guangjun's story, though tragically concluded, leaves us with more questions than answers. His life was one of pain and rejection, but it was also marked by a chilling transformation into something far darker. His crimes were not born from a singular moment of rage, but from a lifetime of unaddressed emotional turmoil, a turning point that led him down a path of violence. As the story of Li Guangjun unfolds, we are left not only with a chilling tale of murder but also with a profound reminder of the importance of addressing emotional pain before it manifests in violence. Could his actions have been prevented? Perhaps. With proper support, understanding, and intervention, his life could have been different. But now, we are left to reflect on the consequences of neglect and the devastating cost of unresolved grief. Li's case challenges us to consider the complex relationship between trauma and violence. It's easy to label someone as evil, but the truth is often much more complicated. Li was a man who, like many, struggled with his demons. His acts of violence were an extreme response to years of rejection, but they were still, in the end, a choice to channel his rage into destruction. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Li's story is the realization that behind every criminal, there's a deeper story, a history of emotional wounds, personal struggles, and unresolved pain. It reminds us that sometimes, the most dangerous forces are not the ones we see, but the silent, hidden forces that shape a person from the inside out. But even after all the pain, the families of the victims can begin to heal. Justice was served, but the scars remain. As for Li Guangjun, his legacy will forever be tied to the tragedy of his victims, the lives he ended, and the lives forever altered by his reign of terror. We thank you for following this haunting journey through the life and crimes of Li Guangjun. The ripple effect of his actions is a chilling reminder that the darkness of one man's heart can devastate so many others. As we close this chapter, we hope you take away the importance of addressing emotional pain, understanding trauma, and recognizing the subtle signs of violence before it's too late. Thank you for watching Crime in Review. If this story has left you with more questions, or if you're looking for more stories that explore the psychology behind crime, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to examine the cases that chill us, challenge us, and leave us thinking long after the screen goes dark. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Please like, share, and comment below with your thoughts. What do you think about Li Guangjun's motivations? Could his crimes have been prevented? We want to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay aware, and never stop asking the hard questions. The world is filled with untold stories, some that need to be uncovered, and some that we must learn from.